What's up, y'all? Welcome to the video. Today we're going to be continuing our work on the enemy 4-hour survival shooter. And in the last video, we set up its behavior tree and made some simple movement tasks for it. And for this video, we're going to be setting up the animations, implementing our attack logic, and implementing our damage and death functionality. So with that, let's get started with our enemy animations. So getting into our animations here, the first thing we're going to want to do is go into our AI folder. And we're going to create another subfolder and just name this animation. Now, the reason we're doing this is while we do have all of our enemy animations in the City of Brass pack, if we go into here, meshes, enemy, we are using the corpse. And if we go into animation, we can see we have all of our animations here, but we want to have quick access while we are making our animation blueprints and our montages and anything else that we edit. So we're just going to all keep it over here for easy access. So before we get into making the animation blueprint, I want to put together our montages and whatnot. But first, we're going to start with a blend space. And the reason we're doing that is because our animations are going to vary based on their walk speed. So our enemies, as the waves progress, they're going to continuously get quicker. So at wave 1, they'll be walking, maybe a little jog, and then as they advance, they're going to get a little quicker, and then eventually some of the zombies are going to be straight up sprinting at you. So we want a blend space to accommodate for those different speeds. So we are going to start with that. So if you right click and go into animation, create a new blend space and use the corpse skeleton. We're just going to name this enemy walk run blend space. And we go into here and go into asset details. So if we go into this, we are going to be only editing one axis, and this is going to account for their speed. Now, normally if you had different directions for your animations, you would put that on the horizontal axis, but we're only going to be using speed, so we're just going to keep it simple and go from there. So we're going to have it go from 0 to their max speed being 400. And if we do that, now we can go into our different animations and plop them on this grid here. So we're going to start with our idle animation, and we're going to make it an alert idle. So drag that out right into here, make it close to 0. And next we're going to need a walk animation. We're going to put that right towards the middle. Up a little bit. And lastly, we're going to have their run. And we are going to use the run forward animation. And now our enemies should be able to go and change the speed of their running or walking based on what we set it to. So with that, if we look here, we have our idle, walk, run. Now that should be all set. Now, we are going to start on making our montages. So we are going to need a attack montage. So if we go into our different animations here for the corpse, we're going to look for attack. And we are just going to go with, actually, let's look through these here. We've got attack fast, push, and we are actually going to start with this. So that is attack fast 2. So if we go with attack fast 2, and we actually we're going to we'll create a montage. Going to create a montage, and we're just going to call this enemy attack montage. And then we're just going to move this over into our animation folder. Now, our other montage that we're going to want is our death montage. So go search up death. And we're going to use this one. So go create anim montage. And we're going to call that enemy death montage. That should be good. And now we should be set to start setting up our animation blueprint. So let's get started on that. So if you right click, go to animation, I'm going to create a new animation blueprint, corpse skeleton, and we're just going to call this enemy anims BP. All right, and we're going to create a new state machine. I'll just call this main states. Add a default slot so that we can play our montages. Good there. And now we're going to go into this. So first thing, I'm going to create a new state. I'm just going to call this idle. Next, we're going to add another state. Call this walk run. And that should be good for now. So going into our idle, we're going to find our idle pose or our idle animation. And we're going to drag that out. So alert idle. Put that in there. Looking good. And if we go back and into our walk run, we're actually going to drag out our blend space. And as of right now, it is actually expecting us to enter a speed. So we're going to make a variable for that and then get that from our event graph. So we'll name this speed. Get our float. Good. Now we're going to want our transitions as well, going from walking and running straight to just idle. And we're going to do that through our event graph. So if we go into here, I'm going to check if the pawn owner is valid. And we are going to make a bool is moving. All right. And we're going to set that. Set is moving. And we're going to get our velocity. And get our vector length. And if that's greater than 0, they are moving. And next we're going to set our speed. Set speed. And we are going to pass in our vector length to that. So I'm just going to make a reroute node. Have that come up into here. Okay, now going back into our states, I'm going to do the same thing we did with our player and look for if it's moving or not. So if it is moving, make the transition. And if they're idle, then they are not moving. Perfect. Now that should be all set. So if we go back and apply that to our animation or our enemy blueprint, enemy anims BP. There we go, we should test that out. And now our enemy is going fairly quick. And if they stop, it'll be a little bit more idle. Now let's test this a little bit by changing the enemy speed. Go into their movement component and change their walk speed to 400. And now they are running at us. Perfect. Just change that back to 300 for now. And that should cover our animation blueprint for now. Okay. So the next thing we're going to want to get into is our damage system. So we're going to get right into our C++ code with that. Now taking a look at our code, first we're going to want to go into our player file, and we're going to add a new method for when the player is taking damage. So method for taking damage. So when the enemy is dealing damage to the player, we are going to call this, and it is going to manage the health from there. So void take damage, and it is going to take in a float damage. So make a definition for that. And one thing we're going to need is a new include. So include, and we're going to need our gameplay statics. So kismet gameplay statics.h. Now, if we go back in down here, so deal our damage, and then we are going to have our death handling. So first for dealing damage, very simple, just take our health and subtract it by the amount of damage. And if our health ever goes below 0 or is 0, then we will just restart the level. Open level and get world. Then we're going to want to do an fname, get world, get name, and that'll get our level name, and absolute true. And that should handle everything for taking damage for the player. Now we're going to go into the enemy. And in our enemy file, we're going to need quite a few things. We're going to need not only just our take damage method, but we're going to need references to our montages and our different sounds. And we're also going to need to make some methods for death handling. So we're going to first start with getting references to our montages. That's going to be headed with a U property. Edit anywhere. Blueprint read write. And category is equal to animation. This will be a UNM montage. And we'll just call this attack montage. The other montage we are going to need a reference to is the death montage. Like so. Now getting references to our sounds. This will be the same header or U property, but it'll be category sound. And this is going to be a T array of a uSound base. And this will be the different possible attack sounds that the enemy can play. Next, we're going to get a reference to the different death sounds that they can play. And lastly, we're going to need just one uSound base of when our enemy is taking damage. Okay, perfect. Now we can get into some of our combat fields that we're going to need, such as our health and whatnot. So we'll start with our float health. It's equal to, make that 30 by default. We're going to need a reference to where they are spawning in the world. So that'll be f vector mv world spawn location. And we'll be using this later when we are implementing our enemy manager. We're also going to need a boolean of whether they are in combat or not. And by default, that'll be false. Okay, now we're going to have our combat methods. So first, we're going to have a method for attacking, a method for taking damage, and that's going to take in a float of damage. And lastly, the death handling methods. So that'll be a void die. And later when we are implementing our enemy manager, we're going to have a reset method. And more will be explained on that later once we get into our enemy manager. And lastly, just like in our player, we're going to need a event handler for when a montage is ended. So montage end event handler. That'll be a U function, void handle on montage ended. That's going to take in a UNM montage and a boolean for if it's interrupted or not. All right, that should be everything we're going to need in our header. So now we can get into implementing this. Now looking at our CPP file, I went ahead and made some definitions for all of these methods. And the first thing we're going to get into is the TakeDamage method. So first, we're going to want to check if the death montage is already playing, because if it is, that means that they're already dead, and therefore they shouldn't take more damage, because that could just trigger more death animations and kind of get everything in a mess. So we're first going to check if the death animation is already running. So pretty much checking if they're dead already. So we're going to UNM instance that's actually going to be equal to get mesh get nm instance. And if that's valid, we're going to check if the montage is playing. So pnm instance montage is playing np death montage. So if this is true, we're just going to return and do nothing else. So next thing we're going to want to do is when they are taking damage, they're going to play an impact sound so we can hear the indication that we hit them. So play damage indication. So So that is going to be if our MP enemy damage sound is not equal to null pointer. And we'll play the sound. So U gameplay statics play sound at location. I'm going to pass in our world, our sound, and we're going to play it at the actor location. Great. Now we can get into actually dealing the damage, and then afterwards handle the death if they are dead. So just like in the player, we're going to take their health and subtract it by the damage. And afterwards, if the health is less than or equal to 0, we're going to play the death method. Now, getting into the death method, first, we're going to want to make sure that our death sounds are valid, and then we'll play those. Death sounds. So pretty much if the list of death sounds is greater than 0, pass in our world. And since this is an array, we're actually just going to randomly play it. So we are going to index through it. So np death sounds. And we are going to do that with fmath random range. It's going to go from 0 to the end of the array minus 1. And then we're going to play that at the actor location. All right. And then after that, we're going to play the death montage. But first, we're going to need to get our anim instance. Check that our death montage is valid, and if so, play it. All right, now that should be everything for death. Now looking at reset, we're actually going to leave this as a to-do. When we go to implement our enemy manager. And now when the death montage is ended, that's normally when we will reset the enemy, but we're actually just going to destroy the actor in this case. But first we got to make sure that the montage that is ending is the death montage. So check for our death montage. I'm just going to do that by the name. So if the montage's name contains death, then reset, but in this case, we're just going to destroy the actor. Now, the last thing we will want to implement is our attack method. So this will be played once we create our attack task in the behavior tree. So we're actually just going to implement this right now so we don't have to worry about it when we go to implement that. So first thing we're going to want to do is get our animate instance. And if that is valid, we're going to play our attack montage. And once that is played, we're actually going to want to get a reference to our player so that we can deal damage to him. So that is going to be done via, well, first we're going to want to actually include our survival character. And we're actually just going to get the survival FPS character. P player is going to be equal to, that's actually a survival FPS character. It's going to be equal to our U gameplay statics get player character get world 0, and we're going to want to cast this to our a survival character. Perfect. And now we can take this P player, take damage, and for now we're just going to have that be 10. And once that is done, we are going to play some attack sounds as well. So play attack sounds, and if the attack sounds are greater than 0, then we'll play it at random just like we did down here. So I'm actually just going to, where did we play it? Here. I'm just gonna do this, but with our attack sounds. Perfect, so that is going to cover all of the enemy methods that we're going to need here. Now we're gonna get into implementing our different tasks so that we can actually have our enemy attack. Now, before we get into implementing our attack task, we're actually going to first need to check if the enemy is in range with the player. So we are going to make a service for that. So if we go and create a new C++ class, go to all classes, and we're going to look for a BT service, Blackboard base. Hit next, and we'll just call this is player in range. And what the service is going to do is it is actually just going to be called before our tasks are run, and it's going to update our Blackboard values. So when we go to actually run the attack task, we're going to know whether or not we can actually attack. So we're going to be checking for if they are in range, but we're going to be calling the service to update our Blackboard values before we actually check that in our attack task. So first off, in our header, I'm going to make a public section right here. And we are going to make our constructor. So constructor U is player in range. And then we're going to need a method for when the service is called. And that is going to be a void on become relevant. And we're going to be passing in our U behavior tree component. AP tree comp. And we're going to be passing in the node memory as well. Now the last thing we're going to need for this header is a field for our range. So that is going to have a U property of edit anywhere. blueprint read write, and its category is going to be AI. And that is going to be a float. Enough range, and the default's going to be 100. And this should not be a star, it should be this. Okay, now we can get into this. So first let's add some includes. First we're going to need our Kismet gameplay statics. Next we're going to need our enemy controller. We're also going to need our Blackboard component. So behavior tree, Blackboard component H. And lastly, we're going to need our enemy keys. And speaking of enemy keys, let's go into that header right now and add our new key for this. So this is going to be tchar const is player in range. And this is where we're going to be holding the boolean of whether or not the player is in attacking range for the enemy. For the constructor, I'm going to set b notify become relevant to true, and we're going to set the node name to is player in range. And getting into our on become relevant, we are going to first have a super call. So on become relevant. And we're just going to pass in our tree component and our node memory. And next we're going to need to get our AI controller and our player controller. And once we have those, we're going to actually need to get their pawns that are connected to them. And once we have those, we can actually set our Blackboard keys, or our key, to whether or not the player is in range. So first, with our AI controller, we're going to make this an enemy controller. Enter. That is going to be casting our tree components .get AI owner. Then from there, a pawn the enemy is going to be equal to our controller get pawn. And now we're going to basically do the same thing, but we're going to use our Kismet gameplay statics to get our player controller. So a player controller be player controller would be equal to gameplay statics get player controller get owner, not get owner, get world 0. Perfect. Now, if we get our AI controller, get Blackboard, can set value as bool, and we're going to pass in our key, and then we are going to set it as whether or not they're in range. So first we're going to do p enemy get distance to p player controller get pawn, and we are going to check that is less than or equal to MF range. Now that we have our player in range service created, now we can get right into making our attack task. So we're going to create a new C++ class, and we're going to go through the same process as the other tasks, and we're going to make a BT task with our Blackboard base. And we're just going to call this BTT attack. Okay, looking into our header, this is pretty much going to be the same as the other tasks that we created, except we are now going to include our enemy header, enemy.h, and we'll take the same methods from chase player, but I'll just change this from chase player to attack. And we're also going to add one more method. This is going to be a Boolean attack montage finished. And with this, we'll pass in an A enemy. And the purpose of this is for us to check whether or not the attack montage is, of course, finished. And this is to help prevent us from attacking once again before the attack is actually finished. So it's going to prevent repeated attacks going over and over again before they've actually finished their first attack. And that is everything that we're going to need for our header. So let's get right into the actual implementation of this. Okay, and once you've made those definitions, we're going to get first into our includes. We're going to include our enemy controller. We're going to include our behavior tree Blackboard component. And we're going to include our keys. All right, and same as all of our other constructors, node name, it's going to be equal to the name, and we're going to call this attack. All right, and now getting into the actual task, first let's get the AI controller. And from there, we'll be getting the enemy from the controller's pawn. So we're going to get our A enemy controller, P AI controller. It's going to be equal to a cast of A enemy controller. And we're going to pass in our tree component .get AI owner. All right, and from there we're going to make an A enemy. P enemy is going to be equal to P AI controller get pawn. And we are going to cast that to an A enemy. All right, and now once we have that, we are going to check if our montage is finished. So if attack montage finished, and we're going to pass in our P enemy. We're then going to get the Boolean value from our key to check whether or not we can attack. So to do that, we're going to get a bool b can attack. It's going to be equal to our AI controller. We're going to get our Blackboard. And then we're going to get value as bool. And then we're going to pass in our key for that. And keys is player in range. And if they can attack, run the enemy attack method. So P enemy, attack. Alright, now that is going to be everything for our execute task, but before we actually go and test this, we're going to need our attack montage finish implemented, because at the moment it's just returning false. So we're going to first start with our UNM instance, PNM instance. It's going to be equal to our AP enemy get mesh, get anim instance. And if our anim instance is not equal to null pointer, we're going to return p_anim instance montage get is stopped, and we are going to pass in AP enemy, and we're going to get our attack montage. So that is everything we're going to need for this task. So let's get right into plugging everything into our behavior tree, our blackboard, and we can start testing this. All right, back in Unreal, we're first going to go and update our enemy blackboard, and we're going to add our isPlayerInRange key. So we're going to set that as a Boolean, name that isPlayerInRange, and now that should be all set. Now we'll go and add our new values to our enemy. So we'll add our attack montage, our death montage, and our sounds. So should be 2 different attack sounds. Two different death sounds. And our zombie impact sound. All right, and lastly, we're going to go and update our behavior tree. So at the moment, we just have our movement-based stuff going on. So what we're going to want to do is go into our sequence. We're going to right-click and add a service, and we're going to go and select our isPlayerInRange service that we created. Go into here. Range is 100 by default. Set the key to isPlayerInRange. And lastly, we're going to move this to the side a little bit. And we're going to add our attack task. So once our behavior tree is ran, it's going to find the player location, chase the player. Simultaneously, it's checking if the player is in range to it. So if that ever happens, once it gets to this task, it is going to attack. So let's test this. So if we get closer to the enemy, as you can see, it is starting to do a little bit of damage to us. It is starting to update in our HUD, and it is playing the different sounds. So that is working, but as you can see, we still can't do much damage to the enemy. So we're going to go and update our weapon component real quick so that we can start damaging our enemies. Now back in our weapon component code, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to come back up into our includes, and we're going to include our enemy header, enemy.h. And after we do our line trace, we're going to attempt to cast this to an enemy. And if that cast is valid, then we know that we have hit an enemy. Otherwise, we know that we hit something completely different. And in that case, we're just going to play an environmental sound. So first, try to cast hit to an enemy. And how we'll do that is going to make an a enemy pointer. P enemy is going to be equal to a cast of a enemy. And we're going to pass in our outHit.getActor. And if P enemy, if this is valid, then we're going to deal damage to our enemy. Take damage. And we're just going to deal 10 for now. All right, now play environmental sounds. And first, we're going to check if these environmental sounds are empty or not. So if check there are sounds in list. And we're going to go if MP environmental sounds dot num is greater than 0. Then we're going to go and play one of those sounds. So uGameplay statics play sound at location. To pass in our world. NP environmental sounds. And we're going to index that. And this is going to be a random range between 0 and the number of sounds minus 1. And we're going to play this at our character's location. To location. All right, now that should be good, and we're going to compile that real quick and go and test it. Before we go test, I actually almost forgot this, but we do need to go into our enemy class, and this handle on montage ended, we actually need to bind this and begin play. So we're going to bind the event, and we're going to get our anim instance. Dot on montage ended. Dot add dynamic. Get rid of that weird internal thing. And we're going to pass in this and a reference to our event. On ended. Should be a enemy. There we go. Now we should be good to go and test. All right, taking a look at this here. All right, so when we are not hitting the enemy, it is playing the environmental sounds randomly. Okay, now let's test with our enemy. All right, when we hit him, it is playing the impact sound for our enemy. And if we kill the enemy, so it properly destroys the actor and plays the death montage, but as you can see there was a split second where it looked like it was trying to transition into a walking animation, so it looked like it was trying to get back up. So the way we can fix that is by adding a death state into our animation blueprint, and that's going to keep it from trying to transition into that state again, and it'll just stay down when it dies. Okay, so with that, we're first going to go into our AI folder and go into our animations. And I actually already went ahead and did this. So I took our enemy death animation and I cut a bunch of the frames and made it so the only frames that it cycles through are where it's just lying there. So it's just going to remain in a constant state of lying down. And we're going to go and implement that into our animation blueprint as a state. So first we get into here and we go into our main states. We're going to add a new state. And this is just going to be called death. And we can go both ways since we'll be able to reset our enemies. And make it go both ways. Just tidy this up a little bit. And if we go into here and we add this as our pose, should be good there. And now we're going to need to make our transition. So we're going to make a new variable and we're going to call this is dead. And this is going to be a Boolean. And we're going to update the value for this in our event graph. So if we go back over here, we are going to move this over a little bit. Before we even set any of that, we're going to be setting whether or not they're dead. All right. And the first thing we'll do with that is we're going to cast to enemy. And we're going to pass in our pawn owner. Actually, we'll make a reroute node so this is a little bit clean. And right there. Move this over a little bit. All right. So if we go and get our health, and it seems we did not make that visible in Blueprint, so we're going to go quickly add that. All right, if we come back into our enemy file, we're going to go back to where we have our health. And we're just going to add this header right here, new property, visible anywhere, Blueprint read only. And if we recompile that, come back into here, now we should be able to get our health. Perfect. And if this is less than or equal to 0, then they are dead. All right, and now that we have that being set, we can go back into our state machine and add those transitions. So, is dead. It's true. And if it's not true, and we'll do the same thing for the other way, for walk and run. All right, and if we test this real quick, and we go and kill our enemy, and now it looks like it is staying down and it is no longer trying to transition into a walk animation after dying. Alright, now that is going to cover everything for this tutorial. At this point, we now have our enemy animations and attack logic, as well as our damage system. In the next video, we're going to be implementing our wave logic and automate our gameplay with the enemy manager. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, please go hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel, and I'll see y'all in the next video.